Today, our guest is Professor Suresh Narine, who is the Anthony N. Sabga Caribbean Award for Excellence, joint awardee in the field of science and technology. Congratulations,
Thank
Professor.
you.
Could you tell us how do you feel of having been awarded the Anson McCall Laureate Award?
Well, of course, it's always a delight to win an award, so I'm happy. I'm particularly pleased, though, that it's this award because one always seeks approbation from home. And I think that in addition to being from my home region, this award has distinguished itself by the choice of past laureates. If you look at the company that I'm now privileged to join, I think it's a company that I'm very happy to be in because a wide range of very distinguished Caribbean men and women have lent their own gravitas to this award, and I'm particularly delighted to join them.
That sounds really interesting. Could we get a little bit about your background? You are from Guyana originally, yes. And could you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your days as a kid and what really enthused you?
I'm glad to try. I think that anyone who looks at this, the problem with putting things on video, of course, is that it serves posterity not necessarily well. So I must be honest, anyone who knew me as a child would know that I was just quite a rambunctious youngster. I got myself into all kinds of trouble. But I grew up in a very small rural village on the banks of the Demerara River, a village called Herstelling. In Guyana, many of these villages started life as part of a plantation. Mm-hmm. And so many of the people in that village worked on the sugar plantations still. With the great holdover culture from colonial times, very small village, fairly poor, but very close-knit. And I think that what was important about growing up in that environment for me, in the context of what we're discussing today, is that the village reared its children together. We were taught, you know, you were although I tried very many times, you were never allowed to be rude to your elders. And growing up, I grew up in a family of 3 older sisters and myself being the youngest. I think what was important in my decision to look at science as a career is that growing up in that sort of cocoon, that sort of close, very nurturing and caring environment, and being a child who got himself into a lot of trouble all the time and was forgiven all the time, I think it created a certain level of confidence, you know, a confidence that you're loved, you know, for yourself, and in my case, often in spite of myself. And I think that confidence from an early age helped to give me the courage to ask questions. And if you have the confidence to ask questions, science is exactly where you should end up. So I think that's one of little anecdote. Not sure
right.
if
it's very interesting that you say it's the background that leads you on to science. In one of your writings, I heard you and I've seen you actually mention about the arts. Mm-hmm. How do you see the arts and science moving together, and how did arts and science propel you into science? Because you made some very insightful suggestions about the role of arts and science.
Yes, well, Dave, I think that maybe some may disagree, but for me, science without the arts would be a very barren endeavor. You know, the iPad would be an expensive paperweight without the humanities giving it content. And for scientists as well, a lack of appreciation for the humanities and the arts would create a very desolate life, a life, I think, without joy. But from a professional perspective as well, unless our science is educated by the arts, unless we understand the role of our science in society and its interaction with things of beauty and of human and environmental value, science as an endeavor, I think, loses all of its raison d'etre. And so I think that it's imperative that our young students at high school, but even into university, that they begin to almost be compulsory to have an exposure to literature, the arts, the humanities, to philosophy, and the origins of our species. I think from an educational curriculum perspective, this is very important. I know at Trent, where I teach, we now make it compulsory for science students to have 6 electives in the arts.
Wow.
And I think this is a very important thing.
That's really interesting. Well, this leads to the question about mentoring. Can you tell us, because you made a special mention of a mentor who took you from year 1 into his laboratory, and then he exposed you to the life of science. Could you expand on it? Is there a role for mentoring in the Caribbean?
I think it's a crucial need in the Caribbean. You know, I'm a firm believer in what we refer to as the Pygmalion effect. And in brief, of course, you know the story of the Greek Pygmalion sculptor who so believed in one of his creations that it came to life. I believe that great scientists and great artists are made, not born. And I believe that what young people need is someone who, first of all, believes in them, but is willing to imbue confidence in that young person that they can achieve in whatever field they're given. In the Caribbean, we are very fortunate within the Caribbean, but also in its very large diaspora, to have a wide range of notable persons that are in the sciences, in the humanities, in the social sciences. And I believe that this, taking a institutionalized approach to mentoring, because it of course happens all the time by accident. It happens by accident, by divine design, by all kinds of informal ways. But I think that to formalize the role that mentorship plays would be an important thing to do at our universities, even within our high schools, and in business. Today we're celebrating an award that was created out of philanthropy of a businessman. So many of our young entrepreneurs and young businesses could benefit from the mentorship of our notable success stories in business and arts and science. So I think it's very important.
Well, this leads naturally to the question about the Chadee initiative and his vision for agriculture in Guyana and the role that you are playing in actually managing part of that initiative. Could you give us an insight?
Well, Dave, this is an area that I'm very passionate about. We live in a tiny archipelago. We have, if you look at the countries that make up the countries that are available for the SABGA award, it's scarcely 6 million people. 6 million people spread out over 10 or so countries. We don't have a marketplace. Yet those countries all have their own governments. Those countries all have their own approach to science and technology. their own approach to agriculture. On top of that, we have many small island states with scarce water resources and not enough arable land. In the Caribbean, we've got countries like Suriname, Belize, and Guyana with large tracts of freshwater resources and arable land and low population densities. The Caribbean is doomed to live a life of food insecurity and growing food insecurity if we don't begin to address doing agriculture in areas that we have land and water, but doing it in such a way as to allow the entire region to benefit. Some of our countries, like Trinidad and Tobago, has enough capital, they're capital rich. The foreign direct investment that this region receives is less than 1% of the entire FDI of the world.
Wow.
But within the region itself, rather than looking for FDI elsewhere, or there's a great opportunity for our countries to collaborate on food, and not just food, but also energy. Great potential exists both in Suriname and in Guyana for all hydropower, alternate sources of energy. Although Trinidad and Suriname are the only two native producers of energy in the Caribbean, the rest of the Caribbean depends on imported energy. Yet we have access to those solutions within this archipelago, but we must not let that go the way of the Chadee initiative. When the Chadee initiative was suggested and proposed by former President Chadee of Guyana, many of the CARICOM leaders at that time saw the vision, endorsed it. But like so many other things, we are not short on vision in the region, but we're very, very poor at implementation. I firmly believe that unless we resuscitate things like the Chadee initiative, this region, the food import bill of this region is unnecessarily astronomical. And as a result of food insecurity, energy insecurity, we're also facing the next insecurity, which is labor. Labor, in addition to petroleum, land, and fresh water, is forming a nexus of tremendous challenges to the world. And unless the Caribbean begins to embrace a holistic view of labor as well, not just agriculture and energy, in terms of standardizing its training, in terms of ensuring that the CSME that allows free movement of labor throughout the region hasn't really worked well because we don't embrace a standardization of our labor. We have multiple universities in the region, again, a region which I remind you is so small, and yet we have multiple duplication, tremendous fragmentation. We're not allowing ourselves to take advantage of critical mass concepts. And so as a region, we really need to recognize that a unified approach to the problems that are on our doorstep is the only way for us to begin to have successful, sustainable solutions.
You know, it's interesting with the Chadee initiative, and one of your areas of research is lipid-derived biomaterials, which comes from agriculture, I guess. Could you tell us a little bit, and this is for the education of the younger kids who may be looking for a career in the future and now, could you explain what lipid-derived biomaterials are, and what kind of future do you see that as a career?
Well, I'm always happy to talk about this, Dave, of course. Let me try to take a 25,000-foot look at it first to set it within context.
Sure.
500 to 700 million years ago, photosynthetic materials from plants that plants create out of carbon dioxide and water, was buried under the sea and in the Earth's crust. And 700 million years later, we're harvesting that material as petroleum. Now, 14 to 15% of all the petroleum we take out of the ground goes into making modern materials. Lubricants, adhesives, plastics and polymers, a variety of materials without which the modern world would not exist. One only has to think, for example, of how ubiquitous plastics are in the world, and you realize that our world would be a very different place without that. Now, let's come back to the petroleum issue. All of that organic matter which was created by photosynthesis is about to be depleted. Estimates vary, but some people think as the tipping point is as close as 30 years away. So as long before we hit the tipping point, the speculative nature of the petroleum market would make petroleum so astronomical in price so as to not be available to regions like ours. So what we have said with others is, why wait 700 million years to use photosynthesis? Let us figure out how to do the chemistry, how to do the materials physics, to take materials that we can grow today and turn it into our plastics and turn it into our lubricants and adhesives. And we have seen a remarkable amount of success in this. From a climate change perspective as well, this makes a lot of sense. Plants photosynthesize and they take carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere, so they sequester it. But plants also respire and they decay. In fact, they put about as much carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere as they take out. And we, as scientists, we learn this as a carbon cycle. A very small amount of that carbon is stored, and that is what became petroleum over that many million years. Now, the problem is, since the Second World War, we have been releasing all of that stored carbon in petroleum by using it as fuels and materials. So we're putting way more carbon into the atmosphere than the plants can remove from the atmosphere. We've upset the balance of the carbon cycle, leading, of course, to a proliferation of carbon in the atmosphere, which leads to global warming, which the Caribbean is particularly precarious about. The banana trees just have to hear that the hurricane coming, you know, and they just lie down. So we have to be careful. Now, what this endeavor does, what lipid-derived biomaterials does, if we can make those materials out of plants today, then when those materials decay, the carbon they put back into the atmosphere is sequestered by successive crop cycles that you create just to make those materials anyway. So it's an elegant solution.
It's a natural cycle.
Right. And of course, many of those materials are also environmentally friendly.
Yeah.
So this is the whole area. Lipids, of course, are fats. We work with the fats that are created in oilseeds, palm oil, soybean oil, etc. But this approach is equally applicable to starches, it's equally applicable to proteins.
So you're a professor at the University of Trent?
Trent University,
Trent
yes.
University. And you also hold a position in Guyana?
That's correct.
The director of the Institute of
Applied Science and Technology.
Applied Science and Technology. Well, we wish to congratulate you once again and thank you for sharing with us.